subscribe to Storylab. Now, let's begin this one. Marshall Kelly had learned patience in the wilderness, how to wait for the right moment, how to read the smallest signs, how to understand that survival was 90% preparation and 10% action. At 34, he'd built a reputation as one of the best search and rescue coordinators in northern Colorado, training volunteers and leading operations that brought lost hikers home to their families. He taught wilderness survival courses on weekends, showing people how to build shelter, purify water, track animals, and most importantly, how to think clearly when everything went wrong. What he hadn't learned, what no amount of training could have prepared him for, was how to survive the destruction of everything that mattered. The morning started ordinary enough. Tuesday, mid-October, with aspens turning gold against the Rockies. Marshall woke before dawn, as always, kissed his sleeping wife Charlotte's forehead, and checked on his kids. Toby, 9 years old, sprawled across his bed with a comic book still clutched in one hand. Down the hall, 3-year-old Sophie slept curled around her stuffed rabbit, thumb in her mouth. Charlotte stirred when he came back to their room. Early training session. Team exercise up at Horsetooth. She'll be back by noon. He pulled on his jacket. Your dad's still coming by to watch the kids? She nodded, already drifting back to sleep. He'll be here at 8. Toby knows to keep an eye on Sophie. Marshall hesitated. Something in his gut twisted, that same instinct that had saved his life twice in the backcountry. But Vernon Avila had watched the kids dozens of times over the past 3 years. He was Charlotte's father, a retired orthopedic surgeon, respected in the community, active in their church. Toby adored his grandfather. Sophie called him Papa and lit up whenever he visited. I'll be back soon, Marshall said, kissing Charlotte again. He should have listened to his instinct. The training session ran over. What should have been a 3-hour exercise stretched to 4 when one of the newer volunteers got disoriented and they had to run a real scenario. Marshall checked his phone at 11:47. No messages. Good. He texted Charlotte. Running late, be home by 1. He stopped for gas on the drive back, filled up his old Ford Ranger, grabbed a coffee. It was 12:23 when his phone rang. Toby's name flashed on the screen. Hey buddy, everything. Dad. Toby's voice cracked, high and terrified. Dad, you need to come home right now. Marshall's blood went cold. He could hear crying in the background, Sophie's desperate wails. Toby, what's wrong? Is everyone okay? It's Papa. Dad, there's blood. Sophie's bleeding and he won't stop, and I try to pull him away, but he's too strong, and Toby broke into sobs. Please hurry. Please. I don't know what to do. Where's your mother? Marshall was already moving, throwing cash at the clerk, sprinting for his truck. She left for her conference this morning, remember? Dad, please, I can't. I'm coming. Toby, listen to me. Marshall's hands shook as he started the engine. His voice came out deadly calm, the way it did when he was coordinating rescues, when panic would kill people. I need you to take Sophie and go to your room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Can you do that? He won't let me. He's holding her, and he told me to go away, and I'm scared. Try, Toby. Be brave. I'm 10 minutes away. Marshall punched the accelerator, his truck fishtailing out of the gas station. Stay on the phone with me. He could hear his son moving, could hear Vernon's voice in the background, too low to make out words. Then Toby whispered. He locked the bathroom door. I can hear Sophie crying, but I can't get in. The bathroom. Marshall's mind raced. Their house, the layout, the windows. Which bathroom? The downstairs one, next to the laundry room. 9 minutes. Marshall hit 90 on a straightaway, blew through a red light. 8 minutes. His phone buzzed with an incoming call for Vernon's number. He ignored it. 7 minutes. Dad, the door just opened. He's coming out. Sophie's not crying anymore. Toby's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Something's really wrong. There's blood on his hands. On his shirt. Toby, run. Right now. Get out of the house and go to the Mitchells next door. I can't leave Sophie. Go! Marshall roared, then caught himself. 6 minutes. Please, buddy. Go get help. He's looking at me. Dad, Toby's breath hitched. He says I'm confused. He says everything's fine, but Sophie's just lying there and she won't move in. The call cut off. Marshall covered the final 6 minutes in 4, running stop signs, mounting curbs, his vision narrowed to a tunnel. He could see his house, their quiet cul-de-sac, Vernon's silver Lexus in the driveway. Everything looked normal from the outside. Peaceful. Wrong. He left his truck running in the middle of the street, door hanging open. Tried the front door locked. Didn't matter. Marshall had taught wilderness survival for 12 years, had learned to use his environment to find the weak points. He drove his shoulder into the door just below the lock, using his weight and momentum exactly right. The frame splintered. The house was too quiet. He moved fast, checking the living room, kitchen. Toby, Sophie, his voice echoed. Then he heard it. Water running in the downstairs bathroom. The door was closed, but not locked. Marshall hit the door hard enough to slam it into the wall. The scene that greeted him would live in his nightmares forever. Vernon Avila stood at the sink, washing his hands. Blood swirled pink down the drain. He turned, his expression shifting from surprise to something like irritation. Marshall, you weren't supposed to come back yet. On the floor, wrapped in towels, Sophie lay motionless. Her blonde curls were matted with blood. Her face was deathly pale. A crimson stain spread across the white towels. Marshall's training kicked in, the same training that let him function during disasters, during the worst moments in the wilderness when people died if you couldn't think. He shoved Vernon aside. The old man stumbled, hitting the wall, and dropped to his knees beside Sophie. She was breathing, shallow but breathing. Marshall's hands moved automatically, checking her pulse, looking for the source of the blood. The towels fell away, and he saw. His daughter's left arm, from elbow to wrist, was carved with deep, deliberate cuts. Not random, not an accident. Symbols, letters. Someone had used something sharp. Marshall's eyes darted to the sink, saw the X-Acto knife next to Vernon's car keys, to carve words into his 3-year-old daughter's skin. The words were still bleeding, marked. She needed to understand. Vernon said from behind him, his voice calm, rational, the way he'd sounded 1,000 times over family dinners. They all need to understand. It's a covenant, Marshall. I've been chosen to. Marshall wasn't listening. He bundled Sophie in clean towels, checked her airways, elevated her arm. She was going into shock. He needed an ambulance, but more than that, he needed his son. Toby, he roared. Toby, he ran. Vernon's mouth tightened. The boy doesn't understand yet. He's not ready. But she was. I saw the signs. She was chosen just like. Shut up. Marshall's voice was quiet now, deadly. He pulled out his phone with bloody hands, dialed 911. I need an ambulance at 2847 Ridgeview Drive. 3-year-old female, multiple lacerations, significant blood loss, shock. His voice was mechanical, professional. Inside, something was breaking apart. Vernon moved toward the door. Marshall caught his wrist without looking, his grip like iron. He'd spent years pulling people up cliff faces, hauling injured hikers, working rope and rock. Vernon tried to pull away and couldn't. You're not going anywhere, Marshall said softly. You don't understand what you're interfering with. This is bigger than you, bigger than. Marshall looked at him, then really looked, and Vernon Avila fell silent. Because what looked back at him from Marshall Kelly's eyes wasn't anger or rage or even hatred. It was something colder. Something that had calculated and measured and found the exact distance between this moment and what would come next. I know exactly what this is, Marshall said. He heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. And I'm going to make sure everyone else does too. The front door burst open. Toby appeared, crying, the Mitchells behind him. The boy saw Sophie and tried to run to her, but their neighbor, Dennis Mitchell, caught him. Let the paramedics work, son. Let them help her. The next hour passed in fractured moments. Paramedics rushing in, checking Sophie's vitals, starting in 4, loading her onto a gurney. Marshall riding in the ambulance, holding his daughter's small hand, watching her chest rise and fall. Police arriving at the hospital, asking questions. Charlotte racing in from her conference 3 hours away, her face destroyed. Vernon being led away in handcuffs, still trying to explain, still insisting there was a purpose, a plan, that Marshall had ruined something sacred. They kept Sophie overnight for observation, stitched her arm. 23 stitches total, the ER doctor said quietly. Gave her antibiotics and painkillers. She woke once, looked at Marshall with confused, terrified eyes, and said, "Papa hurt me." "I know, baby," Marshall whispered, tears finally coming. "I know, but he's never going to hurt you again. I promise." She believed him. That was what broke Marshall's heart most of all. His daughter believed him, trusted him, even after he'd failed to protect her. Charlotte couldn't look at Marshall, couldn't speak. She sat beside Sophie's hospital bed, holding their daughter's good hand, staring at nothing. In the hall, Marshall heard her on the phone with her mother, Maggie Avila, trying to explain what happened, breaking down mid-sentence. Toby stayed close to Marshall, his small body pressed against his father's side. The boy hadn't let go of Marshall's jacket since they got to the hospital. When a hospital social worker tried to talk to him, Toby just shook his head and held on tighter. At 3 a.m., a detective named Gordon Jennings came by. He was 50-ish, tired eyes, the look of a man who'd seen too much. "Mr. Kelly, I need to ask you some questions about today." They went to a private waiting room. Marshall told him everything. The phone call, the drive, breaking down the door, finding Sophie. He kept his voice level, factual, gave times and details. The detective took notes, his pen scratching across paper. "Your father-in-law is in custody," Jennings said. "He's being held on child abuse charges, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and we're looking at some other things. His house is being searched right now. We'll need to interview your son tomorrow, if that's okay. Whatever you need." Jennings hesitated. "Mr. Kelly, I'm going to be straight with you. Vernon Avila is claiming religious delusion, says he was having some kind of spiritual experience. His lawyer is already talking about mental incompetence. He knew exactly what he was doing," Marshall said flatly. "He told me I wasn't supposed to come back yet. He locked the bathroom door. He had everything prepared. That's not delusion. That's planning." "I agree with you." Jennings rubbed his face. "But he's a 72-year-old retired doctor with no criminal record, and his defense is going to argue he had a psychotic break. Best case, we might get him in a psychiatric facility for a few years. Worst case, he didn't finish." Marshall felt something crystallize inside him, hard and cold. "You're saying he might walk. I'm saying the system isn't perfect. I'm saying you should prepare for that possibility." Jennings met his eyes. "I'm also saying, off the record, that I've got a 16-year-old daughter, and if someone did to her what Vernon did to yours, I have a very hard time keeping my head on straight. So whatever you're thinking right now, take a breath. Let the law work first. And if it doesn't," Jennings stood up, "then I never had this conversation." He put his card on the table. "Call me if you need anything. Anything at all." After he left, Marshall sat in the dark waiting room, staring at his hands. They were clean now. He washed Sophie's blood off hours ago, but he could still see it, still feel the sticky warmth. Could still hear Vernon's calm voice. She needed to understand. His phone buzzed. A text from Maggie Avila. "Please tell me this is a mistake. Please tell me Vernon didn't do this. He's my husband. I don't understand." Marshall didn't respond. What could he say? He'd known Vernon for 12 years. The man had given the toast at his and Charlotte's wedding. Had been there when Toby was born, when Sophie came home from the hospital. Had taught Toby to fish. Had read Sophie bedtime stories. How did you miss something like this? How did you not see it? But Marshall was a tracker, and trackers knew that the most dangerous predators were the ones who learned to hide in plain sight, who knew how to be patient, who waited for the perfect moment to strike. Vernon had been waiting. For what? Marshall didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. And then Vernon Avila would understand what it meant when the hunter became the hunted. Morning came gray and cold. Sophie woke crying, reaching for Charlotte, sobbing that her arm hurt. The nurses gave her more pain medication, and she fell back into a restless sleep. Charlotte hadn't slept at all. Her eyes were raw, her face hollow. She looked at Marshall once, and he saw the question there, the one she couldn't bring herself to ask. How did you let this happen? He had no answer. He'd left his children with a monster and called it trust. The hospital social worker, a woman named Sally Fitzgerald, arrived at 8. She was kind but firm, explained the process, Child Protective Services would be involved. There would be interviews, evaluations, therapy for Sophie and Toby. She gave them pamphlets about trauma and healing, numbers to call, resources for families dealing with abuse. Charlotte took the pamphlets with shaking hands. Marshall couldn't even look at them. At 9, Detective Jennings came back with a female detective named Kelsey Wiley. They needed to interview Toby. Charlotte started to protest, but Marshall put a hand on her shoulder. "We have to," he said quietly. "Whatever helps the case." They took Toby to a special interview room designed for children. Comfortable chairs, toys, soft lighting. Marshall and Charlotte watched through a one-way mirror. Detective Wiley was gentle, asking Toby to tell her about yesterday in his own words. Toby's voice was small. "Papa picked us up and took us home. Mom had already left for her trip. Dad was at work. Papa made us lunch, grilled cheese. Sophie got cheese on her face, and Papa laughed. He was normal. What happened after lunch?" Wiley asked. "We watched cartoons. Then Papa said he wanted to play a special game with Sophie. Just her. He took her to the bathroom. I asked if I could play too, but he said no. This game was only for little ones." Toby's eyes filled with tears. "I should have known something was wrong. I should have stopped him." "Toby, nothing that happened was your fault," Wiley said firmly. "You did everything right. You called your dad. You tried to help. You're a hero." "I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I let Sophie down." Marshall closed his eyes. His 9-year-old son sounded exactly how he felt. Toby continued, his words tumbling out. "I heard Sophie crying after a while. She was crying really hard, the way she does when she's really hurt. I went to the bathroom door and tried to open it, but it was locked. I knocked and asked if everything was okay. Papa told me to go watch TV, that everything was fine, but Sophie was still crying. I knew something was really wrong. What did you do?" "I called Dad. He told me to be brave and try to get Sophie out. I knocked again, harder, and Papa got mad. He yelled at me to go away. That scared me even more because Papa never yells. Then I heard the water running and Sophie stopped crying. That's when I got really scared because what if she... Toby couldn't finish. "Take your time," Wiley said. The door opened and Papa came out. There was blood on his hands and his shirt. He was holding his car keys and this knife thing. He looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't his normal smile. He said, "Everything's fine, Toby. Your sister just had a little accident. She's sleeping now. Why don't you go outside and play?" But I could see past him into the bathroom, and Sophie was on the floor, all wrapped in towels, and there was blood everywhere. Through the mirror, Marshall watched his son relive the worst moment of his young life. Charlotte was crying silently, her hand pressed against the glass. "I tried to push past him to get to Sophie," Toby said. "But Papa blocked me. He put his hand on my shoulder, still smiling, and said, 'If you tell anyone about our special game, something bad will happen to your dad.' Then my phone rang. It was Dad calling back. Papa's smile went away. He looked worried. That's when I knew I had to tell Dad, no matter what Papa said." Detective Jennings, standing beside Marshall and Charlotte, wrote something in his notebook. "Kids got more courage than most adults I know," he muttered. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Wiley was thorough but careful, never pushing too hard. When it was over, Toby came out looking exhausted. Marshall hugged him tight. "You did great, buddy. I'm so proud of you. Did it help? Will they lock Papa up forever?" Jennings crouched down to Toby's level. "Son, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure your grandpa never hurts anyone again. You have my word." After the detectives left, Sally Fitzgerald came back. "Mr. and Mrs. Kelly, I need to inform you that based on Sophie's injuries and the circumstances, CPS will be monitoring the situation. This is standard procedure. You're not under investigation, Vernon is. But we need to ensure Sophie and Toby are in a safe environment and receiving appropriate care. We understand," Marshall said. "I'm assigning a therapist who specializes in childhood trauma. Her name is Johanna Rose. She's excellent. I'd like Sophie to see her at least twice a week, and Toby should have sessions as well. You might also consider family therapy." Charlotte nodded numbly. "Whatever they need. One more thing." Sally's expression softened. "I know this is incredibly difficult, but children are resilient. With the right support, Sophie will recover from this. It will take time, but but she'll be okay. Marshall wanted to believe her, but he'd seen his daughter's arm, seen the word carved into her skin, and he knew some wounds never fully healed. They brought Sophie home that afternoon. The house felt different now, contaminated somehow. Charlotte couldn't even look at the downstairs bathroom. Marshall had already torn out the door, ripped up the bath mat, thrown away the towels. He wanted to burn the whole room, but that would have to wait. Sophie clung to Charlotte constantly, wouldn't let her out of sight. Anytime a man, a doctor, a nurse, even Dennis Mitchell who'd helped them, came near, Sophie screamed. The trauma psychologist said this was normal, that Sophie would need time to feel safe around adult men again. Even Marshall couldn't get close without Sophie flinching. That hurt worse than anything. Toby tried to be strong, tried to help, but Marshall could see the weight pressing down on his son. The boy had nightmares that first night, woke up screaming. Marshall held him while he cried, promised him over and over that it wasn't his fault, that he'd done everything right. "I keep seeing her on the floor," Toby whispered. "All that blood. And Papa just standing there like it was normal." "I know, but she's home now. She's safe." "Is she, though? What if Papa gets out? What if he comes back?" "He won't," Marshall said with absolute conviction. "I won't let him." The next morning, while Charlotte took Sophie to her first therapy appointment, Marshall drove to the police station. He needed to know everything. Detective Jennings met him in a conference room, laid out the facts. "We searched Vernon's house," Jennings said. "Found some disturbing things. He had a notebook hidden in his study. Pages and pages of writings about a sacred mission, about marking the chosen ones, about preparing children for the convergence. It's religious themed, but not any religion I've ever heard of. Appears to be his own delusional system." "You said marking the chosen ones. Plural." Jennings hesitated. "We're looking into that." Vernon worked as an orthopedic surgeon for 40 years before retiring. He had access to hundreds of children. "We're checking old files, seeing if there were any unusual cases, any other kids who might have been." He trailed off. Marshall's blood ran cold. "You think Sophie wasn't the first? I think Vernon Avila has been hiding who he really is for a very long time." Jennings pulled out photos, spread them on the table. These were in his notebook. Photos of children at the park, at church, at school events. Sophie is in some of them. So is Toby. But there are others. We're identifying them now. Marshall looked at the photos. Strangers' children, caught unaware, playing, laughing. "Marked for what?" "There's more," Jennings said grimly. "We found medical implements in his basement. Scalpels, clamps, surgical supplies. And we found blood evidence. Old stains on the concrete floor. The lab is analyzing it now, but it looks like Vernon had a workspace down there. A place where he could." Jennings stopped, seeing Marshall's expression. "A place where he could take children." Marshall's voice was flat. "How many? We don't know yet. But Mr. Kelly, if there were others, if Vernon has been doing this for years." Jennings met his eyes. "We might be looking at one of the most prolific predators this state has ever seen. And he hid in plain sight as a respected doctor, a family man." Marshall thought about every time Vernon had offered to babysit, every time he'd taken the kids for ice cream, every moment he'd been trusted with children. How many opportunities had there been? How many children might have disappeared into that basement? "What happens now?" Marshall asked. "Vernon's being held without bail. He's got a court-appointed attorney who's already filed motions for psychiatric evaluation. There'll be a competency hearing in 2 weeks. If he's found competent, we go to trial. If not," Jennings shrugged. "State psychiatric facility, maybe indefinitely, maybe not. And the other children? The potential other victims? We're working with the FBI now. They've got resources for this kind of investigation. But it's going to take time." Time. Marshall thought about Sophie's arm, the word carved there. Vernon had planned this meticulously, had waited for the perfect moment when he'd be alone with her for hours. What had stopped him from finishing whatever he'd started? Only Toby's phone call, only Marshall's early return. What had Vernon planned to do with those extra hours? Marshall didn't want to know, but he knew anyway, could see it in the pattern. Vernon hadn't been carving a word. He'd been carving the first word. There would have been more. A message, maybe, or instructions. something Sophie would have carried on her skin for the rest of her life. "Mr. Kelly," Jennings said carefully, "I know what you're thinking. I know how badly you want to hurt Vernon right now. But you need to let us do our job. If you do something stupid, if you go after him, it could jeopardize the case. He could walk on a technicality." "I'm not going to do anything stupid," Marshall said truthfully. Stupid was reckless, impulsive, emotional. What Marshall was planning would be none of those things. He went home and started researching. Vernon Avila's entire life, laid out in public records, news articles, social media. He'd grown up in Vermont, middle-class family, nothing unusual. Graduated medical school at 26, specialized in pediatric orthopedics. Married Maggie O'Neill when he was 30. They'd had one daughter, Charlotte, when Vernon was 32. Marshall dug deeper. Found a news article from 43 years ago, tiny story in a Vermont paper. Local girl, 8, found after 3 days search. The girl had wandered off from a family picnic. Vernon Avila, then a young doctor, had been part of the search party. He'd been the one to find her, alone in the woods. The article praised him as a hero. Another article, 15 years later, doctor saves boy from drowning. Vernon had been at a public pool when a 5-year-old slipped under the water. He'd performed CPR, saved the child's life. More stories over the years. Vernon volunteering at children's hospitals. Vernon running a free clinic for low-income families. Vernon receiving awards for his community service. All of it was cover, Marshall realized. All of it was Vernon positioning himself as a protector of children, building credibility, creating opportunities. The drowning boy. Had he really slipped, or had Vernon pushed him under, then saved him? The lost girl. Had she really wandered off, or had Vernon lured her away? Marshall couldn't prove anything. But the pattern was there once he knew what to look for. He called Johanna Rose, Sophie's therapist, late that evening. "I need to understand something." Vernon carved a word into my daughter's arm. "Can you tell me what that means psychologically?" Johanna was quiet for a moment. Marking behavior in this context is about ownership and control. The perpetrator is literally branding the victim as property. It's also about permanence. He wanted Sophie to carry a reminder of what he did forever. But there's another element here. What? The word marked suggests Sophie was being selected for something. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Marshall's grip tightened on his phone. The beginning of what? I can't say for certain without evaluating Vernon. But marking behavior is often tied to a series of escalating acts. He may have been preparing her for something worse. After he hung up, Marshall sat in his dark living room, watching the video monitor showing Sophie's room. She was asleep, finally curled up next to Charlotte. Toby was in his own room, door open, nightlight on. His family, his responsibility to protect. And he'd failed, but he wouldn't fail again. Marshall pulled out his laptop and began planning. He'd spent 12 years teaching people how to survive in the wilderness, how to track, how to trap. Now he was going to use every skill he had, every bit of knowledge about reading terrain and predicting behavior and setting up a situation where the prey had no escape. Vernon Avila thought he was a hunter, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd gone after Marshall Kelly's daughter. Now Vernon was going to learn what it meant to be hunted. The competency hearing came 2 weeks later. Marshall and Charlotte sat in the courtroom, watching Vernon shuffle and wearing an orange jumpsuit, flanked by deputies. He looked older, diminished somehow. When he glanced at Charlotte, his eyes filled with tears. "Honey," he called out, "please, you have to understand. I wasn't myself. Something came over me." The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Avila, you will not address the victims or their family." Vernon's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Robbie McLean, stood. "Your Honor, my client is clearly suffering from a severe psychiatric disorder. We request that he be evaluated at the state's psychiatric facility before any proceedings continue." The prosecutor, a young man named Seth Stone, objected. "The defendant has shown clear planning and premeditation. He locked the door, prepared tools, chose a time when he'd be alone with the victim. This was not a psychotic episode. This was calculated abuse." The judge called a psychiatric expert, Dr. Emmanuel McCormick, who'd evaluated Vernon. Dr. McCormick testified that Vernon showed signs of delusional disorder, that he genuinely believed he was on a sacred mission, that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong during the incident. Marshall listened, his face expressionless. Vernon was playing the system, using his medical background and intelligence to manipulate the evaluation. He knew exactly what to say, what symptoms to fake. The judge ruled that Vernon should undergo 90 days of psychiatric evaluation before trial. He'd be held in the state psychiatric facility instead of jail. If the doctors found him incompetent to stand trial, he might never face a jury. "This is insane," Charlotte whispered. "He's going to get away with it." Marshall said nothing. He'd expected this. Vernon was smart, connected, knew how to game the system. But that was fine, because Marshall had his own plan. As they left the courthouse, a woman approached them. She was mid-40s, nervous, her hands twisting a tissue. "Mrs. Kelly, I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Alberta Bray. I saw the news about your father." Charlotte stiffened. "I don't want to talk about him. Please, I need to tell you something. 23 years ago, my son was one of Dr. Avila's patients. He was 6 years old, had a broken leg. One day, after a follow-up appointment, my son came home with a strange cut on his arm, like someone had scratched him with something sharp. When I asked him about it, he wouldn't tell me. He got scared, started crying, begged me not to ask. I took him to another doctor, but by then the cut had healed. It left a scar." Marshall felt his world tilt. "Did you report it?" "I tried, but there was no proof it happened at the hospital. Your father-in-law was respected, had references. The hospital investigated and found nothing. Eventually I dropped it. My son made me promise never to talk about it again." Alberta's eyes welled up. "But when I saw the news, saw what happened to your daughter, I knew I should have pushed harder. I should have stopped him 23 years ago." Charlotte grabbed Marshall's arm for support. "What did the scar look like?" "A word. I never understood what it meant. It said Mark, the same word. The exact same word carved into Sophie's arm. Vernon had been doing this for at least 23 years. Probably longer." "How many?" Marshall asked quietly. "How many kids did you have contact with through Dr. Avila?" Alberta pulled out a folder. "After I saw the news, I contacted other parents from the hospital. Some of them never responded. But 7 of them, 7 families had similar stories. Strange cuts, unexplained marks, children who suddenly became afraid of doctors. I wrote down everything. Names, dates, descriptions." She handed the folder to Marshall. "The police need to see this, but I wanted you to have it first. For your daughter." Marshall took the folder. 7 confirmed victims over 2 decades. And those were just the ones Alberta had found. How many more were there? How many children had Vernon Mark? "Thank you," he said. "This is incredibly brave. I'm so sorry I didn't do more back then. Maybe if I had." "You did everything you could," Charlotte said, her voice thick. "He fooled everyone, even me." After Alberta left, Marshall and Charlotte sat in their car, looking through the folder. Photos of scars, all variations of the same word. Medical records showing Vernon as the attending physician. Witness statements from parents who'd suspected something but been dismissed. "We need to take this to Detective Jennings," Charlotte said. "We will," Marshall agreed. "But first, I need to understand something." That night, after Charlotte and the kids were asleep, Marshall drove to the state psychiatric facility where Vernon was being held. He couldn't get inside, but he sat in the parking lot, watching the building. 3rd floor, East Wing, according to the facility manifest that was publicly available online. Vernon thought he was safe here, thought he could play crazy, avoid prison, maybe even get out eventually if the doctors decided he was cured. But Marshall understood something Vernon didn't. The wilderness wasn't just mountains and forests. The wilderness was anywhere you were exposed, vulnerable, dependent on a system that could break down. And Marshall was an expert at exploiting system failures. He made calls over the next few days, called the parents in Alberta's folder, confirmed their stories, called former colleagues of Vernon's, asked innocent questions about the doctor's time at the hospital, called the FBI agent assigned to the case, a woman named Sophia Bridges, and gave her Alberta's folder. Agent Bridges called him back 2 days later. "Mr. Kelly, this is solid evidence. We're reopening investigations into at least 15 cases that might be connected to Vernon Avila. If even half of these pan out, he's looking at multiple life sentences. If he's found competent to stand trial, Marshall said, "We're working on that." But these psychiatric evaluations, sometimes they take time. Sometimes they come back inconclusive. How long? Could be months. Could be years. The system isn't designed for speed. It's designed for accuracy. But accuracy didn't help Sophie, who woke up screaming every night, who couldn't let Charlotte out of her sight, who flinched away from Marshall like he was a threat. Accuracy didn't help Toby, who stopped talking about what happened, but whose drawings and therapy showed dark figures looming over small children. Marshall couldn't wait for the system to maybe, possibly, eventually deliver justice. He needed to deliver it himself. He spent the next week preparing, researching, learning everything about the psychiatric facility. Security protocols, staff schedules, patient routines. He reached out to contacts from his search and rescue work. Emergency personnel, EMTs, people who knew how systems worked and where the gaps were. And he reached out to the parents in Alberta's folder. 7 families, 7 children who'd been marked by Vernon Avila. All of them wanted the same thing Marshall did. Certainty that Vernon would pay for what he'd done. They met in a church basement, 15 people sitting in a circle like a support group. But this wasn't about support. This was about justice. The law failed our children, Marshall said, addressing the group. Vernon Avila marked them, traumatized them, and now he's sitting in a comfortable facility playing mind games with psychiatrists. In 90 days, maybe less, those doctors might decide he's not competent to stand trial. He'll be transferred to a long-term psychiatric hospital. Eventually, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, some other doctor will decide he's cured. He'll be released. And he'll do this again. "What are you suggesting?" asked Frederick, or father of one of the marked children. "That we storm the facility and kill him?" "No. Murder makes us as bad as him. But there are other ways to ensure justice." Marshall laid out his plan. It was complex, requiring precise timing and cooperation from multiple people. It was also completely illegal. But every parent in that room agreed to help. The execution began 3 weeks later. Marshall had mapped out every step, accounted for every variable. He learned from the wilderness that successful operations depended on patience, observation, and adaptability. Phase 1. Get inside the facility. Marshall used his reputation as a search and rescue coordinator to arrange a training seminar at the psychiatric facility on emergency response protocols. He brought 4 volunteers, including Dennis Mitchell, his neighbor, who'd agreed to help after learning what Vernon had done. The facility administrator, eager to improve their emergency procedures, welcomed them. Marshall spent 6 hours inside, observing everything. Camera placements, staff rotations, patient movement patterns. He noted that Vernon had a private room on the 3rd floor, that he was allowed limited interaction with other patients, that he received visitors, including his attorney, twice a week. He also noted something crucial. The facility's pharmacy was understaffed and undersecured. Medications were tracked, but not perfectly. Gaps existed. Phase 2. Establish the pattern. Over the next 2 weeks, Marshall visited the facility 3 more times, each time as part of legitimate business, bringing new emergency equipment, conducting follow-up training, checking on implementation. Each visit, he learned more, saw more. Security got used to seeing him. He became part of the landscape. He also arranged for the other parents to visit. Not Vernon. They wouldn't be allowed access to him. But they visited other patients, posed as family members, established their presence. The facility was large, underfunded, overcrowded. A few extra visitors weren't noticed. Phase 3. The setup. Vernon's attorney, Robbie McLean, visited every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Marshall knew this because he'd been tracking her movements. He knew she arrived early, worked in the consultation room for 20 minutes before Vernon was brought in. He knew she left her briefcase unattended during those 20 minutes while she used the restroom. On a Tuesday in late November, Marshall watched Robbie enter the facility. 15 minutes later, one of the parents, a woman named Carolyn Kelly, who worked as a paralegal, created a distraction in the lobby, dropping a heavy box of files, papers scattering everywhere. Staff rushed to help. Marshall, wearing visitor credentials and carrying emergency equipment, entered through the staff entrance. He reached the consultation room, found Robbie's briefcase, and planted a USB drive in the inside pocket. The drive contained files, real legal documents he'd obtained through contacts, mixed with fabricated evidence showing Vernon's extensive history of abuse, maps of future targets, plans that made Vernon look like a calculated predator rather than a delusional patient. The plan wasn't to use these files in court. The plan was to make Vernon look dangerous enough that the psychiatric facility would increase his security, would watch him more closely, would document everything he did. Because Marshall needed Vernon to crack. Phase 4. The pressure. Over the next 3 weeks, Vernon's life in the facility became increasingly uncomfortable. Small things at first. His meals arrived cold. His medication timing changed. His therapy sessions were interrupted. He complained to staff, but nothing serious was documented, just minor inconveniences that could be explained away as the facility being understaffed and overworked. Marshall had reached out to several staff members, those who'd heard about Vernon's case and were disgusted by it. He'd asked for their help making Vernon's stay unpleasant but not abusive. They'd agreed. No one wanted to help a child predator get comfortable. Vernon started acting paranoid. He complained that other patients were threatening him. He claimed staff were conspiring against him. All of this was documented in his file, making him look increasingly unstable. Meanwhile, news leaked to the media about the 7 other victims, about the FBI investigation. Vernon's face was on every news channel. The facility started receiving threats from the public. Security had to be increased. Vernon requested a transfer to a different facility. His request was denied. Phase 5. The trigger. Marshall knew Vernon's psychological profile now. The man was a narcissist who believed he was special, chosen, above normal rules. Being trapped in a facility, surrounded by people he considered beneath him, losing control of his narrative, it was eating at him. Vernon needed to feel powerful again. He needed to demonstrate that he was in charge. So Marshall gave him an opportunity. He had Frederick Orr's 14-year-old daughter, Emily, send Vernon a letter. The facility screened all mail, but the letter was carefully written, innocent enough to pass inspection, but with subtle phrasing that would trigger Vernon's obsession. Emily wrote that she'd heard about Vernon's important work, that she understood he was misunderstood, that she believed he was meant for something greater. Vernon responded. His letter back was cautious but revealing. He talked about his mission, about chosen children, about how someday people will understand. The letter was flagged by facility staff and added to his file. But Vernon didn't stop writing. He wrote to Emily 5 more times over 2 weeks, each letter more explicit, outlining his beliefs, his plans, his absolute conviction that he'd done nothing wrong. Every letter was documented. Every letter made it harder for Vernon's defense to claim delusion or incompetence. Then came the final phase. Phase 6, the trap. Marshall arranged for Charlotte to visit Vernon. She'd been refusing for weeks, couldn't bear to see her father after what he'd done. But Marshall convinced her this was necessary. He needs to see you one more time, Marshall said. He needs to know exactly what he destroyed. Charlotte agreed, though it cost her everything. The visitation was supervised, recorded, everything by the book. Charlotte sat across from Vernon in a small room, a guard outside the door. Vernon looked at his daughter with desperate hope. Charlie, he said, using his childhood nickname for her. Thank God you came. I've been trying to explain to everyone. Explain what, Dad? Charlotte's voice was cold. Explain why you carved a word into my daughter's arm? Explain why you marked her like property. She's marked. She's special, chosen. You don't understand. I understand that you're a monster. I understand that you hurt children. I understand that I brought my babies to your house, trusted you, loved you, and you were planning this the whole time. Vernon's face twisted. You're just like everyone else. You can't see the bigger picture. Sophie was ready. She was perfect. If your husband hadn't interrupted, I would have completed the covenant, and she would have been transformed into what? Charlotte leaned forward. Tell me, Dad, what were you going to do to my daughter? Vernon looked at the camera in the corner, seemed to remember where he was. I wasn't myself. The doctors say I was having an episode. I don't remember everything clearly. Yes, you do. You remember exactly what you did. You planned it. You locked the door. You prepared your tools. You carved the first word, and you were going to carve more. What was the message going to say, Dad? What were you going to write on my 3-year-old daughter? Vernon's mask slipped. His expression shifted from paternal concern to something else. Cold calculation, contempt, superiority. You wouldn't understand, even if I explained it. You're not chosen. You never were. I tried with you when you were young, tested you, but you failed. You weren't strong enough. But Sophie, she has potential. Charlotte stood up, her face white. Thank you for confirming what I already knew. You're not sick. You're not delusional. You're evil. She walked out. Vernon called after her, his voice rising. You'll understand someday. When the convergence happens, when the marked ones fulfill their purpose, you'll see I was right. You'll regret. The guards shut down the visitation. Vernon was escorted back to his room, agitated, ranting. Everything was recorded. Later that night, Marshall received a call from Robbie McLean, Vernon's attorney. Mr. Kelly, I need to speak with you. It's about my client. They met at a coffee shop. Robbie looked exhausted. I'm withdrawing from Vernon's case. I can't continue representing him. Why? Because he just admitted on record during a supervised visit with his daughter that he was fully aware of what he was doing when he harmed your daughter. He essentially confessed. There's no defense anymore. He's competent to stand trial, and he's guilty. She rubbed her face. The psychiatric evaluation will reflect this. Vernon will be transferred back to jail, and he'll face trial for aggravated child abuse, attempted kidnapping, and a dozen other charges. With the evidence the FBI has gathered about the other victims, he's looking at life in prison. Marshall felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly. How soon? The transfer will happen within a week. The trial will probably be scheduled for early next year. But Mr. Kelly, she hesitated. Vernon is making threats. He's saying that if he goes to prison, he'll make sure your family pays. He's still trying to exert control. Let him try, Marshall said quietly. He's not in control anymore. He never will be again. Vernon Avila was transferred back to county jail 3 days before Thanksgiving. The psychiatric evaluation concluded that he was fully competent to stand trial, that his claims of delusion were manipulative rather than genuine, and that he posed an ongoing threat to children. The trial date was set for February 14th, Valentine's Day. The prosecutor said it was random scheduling, but Marshall thought there was a certain poetry to it. A day about love and protection, devoted to ensuring a predator could never hurt another child. News of Vernon's arrest and the evidence against him spread through the community. People who'd respected him, who'd been treated by him, who'd let him near their children, felt betrayed and horrified. His name became synonymous with hidden evil. Maggie Avila filed for divorce. She moved out of their house, went to stay with her sister in Wyoming. She called Charlotte once to apologize, to say she'd never suspected, never imagined. Charlotte couldn't bring herself to respond. The house where Vernon had lived, where his basement workshop had been discovered, was seized as evidence. Marshall drove by it one day in December, looked at the boarded-up windows, the crime scene tape. Someone had spray-painted "Monster" across the garage door. Vernon's trial approached. The prosecutor, Seth Stone, told Marshall they had an overwhelming case. Vernon's confession during Charlotte's visit. The testimony from multiple victims. The physical evidence from his house. Expert witnesses who would explain the pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, Stone said. I'll make sure of it. But Marshall wasn't satisfied with prison. Prison meant Vernon would have a bed, meals, medical care. He'd have books and television, and maybe even respect from other inmates who might see his intelligence and medical knowledge as useful. Prison wasn't enough. So Marshall implemented the final phase of his plan, the one he'd been building toward all along. He visited Vernon in jail. It took some convincing, but the facility allowed it. Vernon looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, his silver hair unwashed, his face gaunt. But his eyes still held that calculating gleam. Marshall, Vernon said as he sat down, I wondered when you'd come. I wanted to see you one more time before the trial. To gloat? To threaten me? No. To understand. Marshall leaned forward. Why Sophie? Why mark her? What was the point? Vernon studied him. You really want to know? I do. Vernon glanced at the guard, then lowered his voice. Because I could. Because she was available and vulnerable and perfect. Because marking her made her mine in a way you never could. Even now, even with me locked up, every time she looks at her arm, she'll remember me. I'll be part of her forever. Marshall kept his expression neutral, but inside, his resolve crystallized. You think you won. I know I did. You can put me in prison for life, but I've already marked 8 children. 8 souls who carry my message on their skin. 8 who will never forget me. And if I'd had more time with Sophie, if you hadn't interrupted, Vernon smiled slightly. Well, let's just say the full message would have been extraordinary. What was the message going to say? That's my secret. Something for me to know while I sit in my cell, thinking about what could have been. Marshall stood up. Thank you for your honesty. Wait. Vernon looked confused. That's it? You just leaving? I got what I came for. As Marshall walked out, he heard Vernon call after him. You can't break me, Marshall. I'm stronger than you. I'll outlast all of you. Marshall didn't look back. That night, he made his final arrangements. He'd been planning this for weeks, building relationships, establishing credibility. Now it was time to execute. He contacted every parent of every marked child, showed them what Vernon had said, how he'd gloated about his crimes, how he showed no remorse. The parents were furious, heartbroken, desperate for real justice. The law is going to lock him up, Marshall told them, but he'll be comfortable, protected. He'll have access to educational programs, might even work in the prison medical ward helping other inmates. He'll be valued. So what do? Frederick Orr asked. We make sure everyone in that prison knows exactly what Vernon did. We make sure every inmate, every guard, every administrator understands that Vernon Avila is a child predator who carved words into baby's skin. We make sure he has no protection, no value, no safety. That's a death sentence, Alberta Bray said quietly. Prisoners don't tolerate child abusers. I know, Marshall said. The group was silent. Then one by one they nodded. Marshall reached out to his contacts, people who knew people whose cousins or brothers or friends were in the prison system. He provided them with detailed information about Vernon's crimes, the photos of marked children, Vernon's own word from his confession to Charlotte. The information spread. By the time Vernon was transferred to state prison after his trial in February, every inmate in the facility knew who he was and what he'd done. Vernon's attorney tried to get him placed in protective custody. The warden agreed initially, but protective custody was isolated, lonely, its own kind of hell. And sometimes administrative errors happened. Schedules got mixed up. Doors got left unlocked. Marshall didn't know exactly what happened to Vernon in prison. He didn't want to know the details. But 6 months after Vernon was sentenced to life without parole, he received a call from Detective Jennings. Mr. Kelly, I thought you should know. Vernon Avila died last night in prison. It's being investigated as a homicide, but Jennings paused. Let's just say no one is particularly motivated to solve this case. Marshall felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just a hollow certainty that one threat had been eliminated. Thank you for telling me, he said. Mr. Kelly, I don't know if you had anything to do with what happened to Vernon. Officially, I don't want to know. But unofficially, sometimes the system doesn't deliver the justice people deserve. Sometimes people have to find other ways. I don't know what you're talking about, detective. Of course you don't. Take care of your family, Mr. Kelly. They're lucky to have you. After he hung up, Marshall sat in his truck, staring at nothing. Was he supposed to feel good about this? About orchestrating Vernon's death through a web of contacts and information? About ensuring a man was murdered in prison? He didn't feel good, but he didn't feel guilty either. Vernon Avila had marked 8 children, had planned to mark more, had destroyed lives and families and innocence. The legal system would have kept him fed and housed and breathing for decades, giving him time to feel important, to communicate with other predators, to maybe even corrupt guards or social workers or create new opportunities for harm. Now he was gone. The threat was eliminated. Sophie would still have nightmares. She'd still carry the scar. But she'd never have to worry about Vernon getting out, about him finding her again, about him finishing what he started. That was enough. It was August, nearly a year after the incident, when Sophie had her first good day. Marshall was in the backyard with both kids, teaching them to identify plants and track animals, skills he'd used in search and rescue for years. Sophie was 5 now, braver than she'd been, though she still had moments of fear. She stayed close to Charlotte most of the time, still uncomfortable around men, even Marshall. But today was different. Sophie walked right up to Marshall, looked at him with her serious blue eyes, and said, "Daddy, can you teach me to be strong like you?" Marshall's throat tightened. "You're already strong, sweetheart." "No, I mean," she held up her scarred arm. The word was still visible, though fading. "Papa hurt me because I was weak. But you're strong. You protected me. I want to be like you, so no one can hurt me again." Marshall knelt down, a level with his daughter. "Sophie, listen to me. What Papa did wasn't your fault. You weren't weak. You were 3 years old. Children aren't supposed to protect themselves from adults. Adults are supposed to protect children. I failed to do that, and I'm sorrier than I can ever tell you. But you saved me," Sophie said. "Toby called, and you came, and you stopped Papa. You were strong. Being strong isn't just about fighting or stopping bad people. Being strong is about going to therapy even when it's scary. It's about getting up every day even when you're afraid. It's about talking about what hurts instead of hiding it. You've been doing that for a year now, Sophie. You're one of the strongest people I know." Sophie considered this. Then she hugged Marshall, something she hadn't done in months. Marshall held her carefully, this brave, damaged, resilient little girl who'd survived something no child should endure. "I love you, Daddy," Sophie whispered. "I love you too, baby. Always." Toby wandered over, sat down beside them. At 10 now, he was quieter than he'd been before, more serious. The weight of what he'd witnessed had changed him. But he was also fiercely protective of Sophie in a way that made Marshall's heart ache. "Dad," Toby said, "I heard some kids at school talking about Papa. About what he did. They called him a monster. He was," Marshall said simply. "Some people hide what they really are for a long time. Papa was very good at hiding. But you found him. You made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else." Marshall met his son's eyes and saw an understanding there that was too old, too knowing. Toby was smart enough to have pieced together at least some of what happened. How Vernon had died in prison, how the other families had been involved, how Marshall had been at the center of it all. "Sometimes," Marshall said carefully, "when the world doesn't protect the people we love, we have to find our own way to keep them safe." Toby nodded slowly. "I want to learn how to do that. When I'm grown up, I want to be able to protect people like you do." "Then I'll teach you," Marshall promised. "I'll teach you how to track, how to plan, how to read a situation and understand what people really are underneath what they show the world. But more than that, I'll teach you that the most important thing is being there. Showing up, being trustworthy. That's what really protects people." Charlotte came out then, carrying lemonade. She looked at Marshall holding Sophie, at Toby sitting close, at their family trying to heal in the golden August sunlight. She'd lost weight, had gray streaks in her hair now that hadn't been there before. She smiled less, but she was still here, still fighting, still loving these children with everything she had. "I made your favorite," she told the kids. "Extra sweet, just how you like it." Sophie ran to get a glass. Toby followed. Charlotte sat down beside Marshall, took his hand. "Did you hear?" she asked quietly. "They arrested 2 more men who were connected to Vernon. The FBI found evidence he'd been communicating with them, sharing information about children, planning coordinated attacks." "I heard." Marshall had made sure that information reached the right authorities. Had made sure Vernon's network was exposed, dismantled, destroyed. It's not over, is it? The evil he did, it keeps rippling out. But we stop it where we can. We protect who we can. Marshall squeezed her hand. And we make sure our kids grow up knowing they're safe, they're loved, and they're stronger than anything that try to break them. Charlotte leaned against his shoulder. "I keep thinking about what you said, about how predators hide in plain sight, about how Vernon was my father and I never saw it. How do we trust anyone? How do we let the kids have normal relationships with adults when we know what can happen? We pay attention, We teach them to pay attention. We create a world where they feel safe telling us if something's wrong. Marshall looked at his children, laughing now, some of their old lightness returning. And we trust that we're stronger together than any monster could ever be alone. That night, after the kids were asleep, Marshall sat at his computer and deleted files. All his research on Vernon, all his planning documents, all the contact information for the families who'd helped him. He deleted messages, cleared browser histories, wiped everything clean. What had been done couldn't be undone. Vernon was dead. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. Now Marshall's job was to be a father, to help his children heal, to prove every day that they were safe and loved and that the world held more good than evil. He checked on Sophie one last time before bed. She was sleeping peacefully, her scarred arm tucked under her blanket. The word Vernon had carved was fading, would eventually be just a shadow. Maybe when Sophie was older, she'd get a tattoo over it, transform the mark into something beautiful, take back ownership of her own skin. Marshall kissed her forehead gently. "You're going to be okay," he whispered. "You're going to be more than okay. You're going to be extraordinary." In the morning, Marshall would wake up early and go for a run in the mountains he loved. He'd come home to breakfast with his family. He'd go to work teaching survival skills, helping people learn to navigate the wilderness. He'd live his life, but he'd never forget what he'd learned, that the worst monsters don't hide in forests or caves. They hide in plain sight, wearing friendly faces, earning trust, waiting for opportunities. And he'd never stop watching for them, because that was what fathers did. They watched, they protected, they eliminated threats. Vernon Avila had thought he was a hunter, marking children as his prey. He'd learned too late that Marshall Kelly was better at hunting, and Marshall would always protect his own.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.